Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the CSS Translate property. So let's get into it. So what is the Translate property and what can we do with it? Well, it allows us to position an element along the horizontal, vertical, or the z-axis for 3D translations. And it's really useful when we need to have precise control over where to position an element in a container. So what is the CSS syntax for the translate property? Well, we have the name of our property, which is translate, and then we have three values that we can have, so up to three values. Now, of course, you don't need to have all three, but you do need to have at least the first one. And the first value here is the X offset. So basically, the value for the horizontal movement of your element. Next, we have the Y offset. So this is the vertical movement or translation of our element. And finally, we can have the Z offset, which is for, as I said earlier, for 3D translations. And we will see how all of this works in practice later on when we do an example. Now keep in mind that for each of these values, there are certain units that you can use. So for the X offset and the Y offset, you're allowed to use any CSS length unit, such as the pixels, the rams, ams, etc. Or you can also use a percentage. This is going to be the percentage of your actual element that you're moving. And for the Z offset, you're only allowed to use the length. So just keep these in mind. So one possible source of confusion might be, what is the difference between the translate property and the translate function? And in fact, the translate property is equivalent to the translate function or the translate 3D function of the CSS transform property. Now, the transform property with its functions has existed for quite a while, and the translate property is actually much newer, and it's only been introduced more recently to CSS as its own property. Okay, and we will see what that means later on. But just to give you a nice little kind of summary of the relationship between these. So basically, the translate property for horizontal only translation is equivalent to the transform translate X. So by X, of course, I mean the value for the horizontal offset, or it's also equivalent to the translate X, right? So I hope I'm not confusing you here, but you can see on the screen what I'm talking about. For the translate XY, so this is when we have a value for both the horizontal and vertical offsets. This is equivalent to the transform translate XY or to the translate Y. Now, this is not entirely accurate. For the translate Y, this allows you to only move your element vertically, right? So if you had 0 for the X value and then something for the Y, that would be equivalent to the translate Y, right? And now let's look at the last one. So the translate X, Y, Z. So this is when you have a value for each of the coordinates. So horizontal, vertical, and also the depth. This is equivalent to the transform translate 3D X, Y, Z, or to the translate Z. So again, translate Z is actually only gives us the ability to specify the depth of our element. Okay, so I think for me personally, this was really useful to kind of understand how these relate to each other, so that kind of I know exactly what's going on here. So I hope it's also useful for you. Okay, so now let's get into the actual example so that we can see how all of this works and try to make sense of it. All right, so let's look at our code now. As you can see on the left, I have my Visual Studio Code open, and on the right, I have my browser. I'm using Google Chrome. Now, in my VS Code, I'm also using an extension called Live Server, which allows me to preview my code here in the browser. And I also have autosave activated so that whatever changes I make, they automatically take effect here on the right. Okay, so I have two files. I have index.html, which has a basic HTML skeleton. The only thing I have here is in my body, I have a div with a class of container, which is this outer container. And I have another div with a class of element, which is the orange box. Okay, so very simple. I also have a link here to my external style sheet, which is this one right here. So let's see what's going on in the style sheet. I have some resets at the top. For my container, I'm giving it a width of 350 px, okay, and a height of 180 px, a border of 3 px solid gray, and a margin of 80 px in auto to make it centered on the screen. Now I also have a perspective here property, which is commented out currently. Don't worry about this. We will come back to it later. And for my element class, I have a background color of coral, and I have a width and a height of 90 px. So it's a perfect square. Okay, so this is the code we're going to be working with to learn about the translate property. So let's start with something very basic. We're just going to say, let's say I want to move my box horizontally first. So let's say 30 pixels to the right. So how would I do that? Well, you will recall that if you enter only one value for the translate property, that's going to be the horizontal offset, right? So if I say 30 px, my box is going to move 30 pixels to the right. Now, if you do a negative value, by the way, it's going to move 30 pixels to the left, so the opposite direction, right? So the other thing I can do, as I mentioned, is I can use percentages instead of length units. So if I say, for example, let's say 50%, that's going to move my box 50% to the right, and the percent is, of course, the percentage of its original width of the width of my element, right? You can see this easier if you type in 100. You can see the box has moved 100% of its width to the right side. Okay, so that's really neat to know. So let me keep 30 pixels to the right. And now let's say I want to move it down as well. So along the vertical axis, or the y-axis. And this time I'm going to use 20 px, so 20 pixels. And as you can see, it's moved down by 20 pixels. Perfect. So the last value is, of course, the Z value. And again, this is only used for 3D translations. So for this, we have to have our perspective activated on the parent container. Okay. So as you can see, if I enter something here now, like let's say I say minus 200 pixels, nothing changes, right? That's because we don't have our perspective. So let's uncomment this. And now, as you can see, our box has shrunk, and that's because it's kind of moved away from us. Remember, the Z value, it's all about depth. So how far away or how close to us an element is. So in this case, it's far away. Let's say if we make it minus 100, it's going to be closer. And if we make it, let's say minus 10, it's going to be even closer, right? So that's how we achieve these effects. Now, most of the time, you probably will not be using this third value, because most of the time we use translate for only a kind of 2D translations. So either horizontally or vertically. Good. Now, let me quickly show you The old way of doing this, as I mentioned to you, we used to achieve the same effects using the transform property and then the different functions that it comes with, right? So let me comment this out rather, and I'm going to do the same thing that we just did, but this time using the transform property. So I'm going to say transform, say 30px, I should say translate, of course. I need my function name, and then I'm going to say 30px and 20px. And as you can see, we have the exact same effect. So again, if I comment this out and bring this in again, you will see that it's the exact same thing, right? Good. So you might be asking yourself, what should I use? Which one should I be using that, right? Now, of course, it doesn't matter. In this case, either one will work, right? But there are situations when one is better than the other. For example, you might be aware that there's other functions that you can use with the transform property, such as the scale function. So let's say that I'm going to comment this out again. Let's say I want to scale my element here so that it's smaller by 20%. So I want to make it 80% of its original size. So traditionally what I would do is I would say transform scale and then 0.8 to make it 80%. And as you can see, it's now 80% of its original size. Now, let's say in addition to this, I also want to move it 30 pixels to the right. So using the old way, I would say transform, translate, 30 pixels, right? Well, you can see the problem here. It did move 30 pixels to the right, but it's lost its scaling, right? It's no longer 80% of its size. Now, why do you think that happened? Well, that's because according to the rules of CSS, right? If you have two properties that are the same, the last one is always going to override whatever came before. So in this case, the translate or the transform translate is overriding the transform scale, so that the scale really is not happening at all here. The scaling is not happening at all because it's been overridden, right? So this is a problem, as you can see. And to avoid this problem, we need to use the individual properties of scale and translate. So this is where the properties are much more useful than the kind of the transform plus function. I hope this is making sense. So let me show you how we would achieve this. I'm going to comment these out again. And I'm going to say scale property, say 0.8. Perfect. So you can see my box is 80% of its size. And now I'm going to use the translate property. Oops. And 30px. And it's also moved 30 pixels to the right. So both of these are now taking effect. And that's because they're two different properties and they're not overriding each other. So this is a very good example of where using individual properties is much better, or in fact is the only way to achieve both of these effects, right? Instead of using the transform property. So I hope this makes sense. I hope you learned something useful. Please feel free to experiment as always, so you can really understand in depth what's going on here. And I will see you in the next video.